Hello, everyone. Seth here with the world of paleoanthropology. Today, we have a very special episode of The Story of Us. As you may notice, there are three guests joining me today, and we're going to be talking about two high impact papers that came out recently that I think are very important to our understanding of human origins. And we're going to talk about these two papers involving the Paranthropus hand that was recently discovered and some analysis of an Ardipithecus ankle bone and what that might mean for our ancestors' locomotion. I am joined by Cody Prang, Carrie, Mongle, and Kaylee Orr. And all three of these individuals are very kind to come on the show today, and I'm very happy to host them all. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. I'm not sure if it's viewed the same on your screens, but if we want to start with introductions from the top left down, so that would be Cody first. I don't know if it looks the same on your screens, but that would be great. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your academic role, and your interest in the topics of tonight and your involvement so far, just briefly, so we can get a little bit of who you all are, and then we can get into the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having us here. My name is Cody Prang, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. And my primary research interest is in the functional morphology and evolution of hominins, and specifically the origin of bipedal locomotion. And so I helped out with the description and analysis with some of the foot elements associated with the new boisei material, but also the new analysis of the Ardipithecus talus, as you mentioned.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having us. So my name is Carrie Mongle. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Turkana Basin Institute at Stony Brook University. My primary research interests are in figuring out how all of these hominins are related to one another. The first step of that is finding new fossils. And as part of that, I work very closely with Louise Leakey on the Kubifora research project, which is how I came to be involved with that hand description.
Very cool. And last but not least, Dr. Orr, how are you?
I'm great. Yeah, thanks for having us, Seth. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Cell and Developmental Biology in the School of Medicine at the University of Colorado's Anschutz campus. I always say that my position doesn't tell people very much about what it is I actually do, but I'm a paleoanthropologist, biological anthropologist, interested in early hominin evolution, especially the functional anatomy of early hominins kind of below the neck, which also is interesting since I mostly just got wrapped up my semester teaching dental students about everything above the neck. So again, my position doesn't quite tell what I do in my research time, which is a lot of specialty on hands and feet in particular, which is how I've gotten involved with both of these projects.
Very exciting. And again, I just want to thank all three of you for being here this evening. It's going to be a very enjoyable episode, I feel, and I'm glad to have you all. So to start off our discussion, I wanted to talk about the paper that is in regards to the Paranthropus hand that was recently discovered. And I guess the first question that I have regarding this is, where was this hand found? Who found it? And what was the first few things learned about it? Whoever might want to answer that first, and then you can go from there.
So the hand was initially discovered in 2018 by a member of Louise Leakey's survey and excavation team. They're out doing surveys in the Kubifora deposits on the eastern side of Lake Turkana almost year-round. And so John Laurenchenko discovered a large hominin molar on the outcrops. And when they started kind of looking around the site, so that was just on the surface, they started looking around the site, they saw what turned out to later be a hominin hand bone, but at the time it was so unusual looking, they weren't totally sure if it was a pig or something else. It didn't fit their mental image of what a hominin hand bone might look like. Anyways, so Louise came up shortly after that, took a look at what the team had found. At that point, Louise was positive that they had a Paranthropus boisei lower molar. They're very distinctive, so she was She was sure about that. And then there were a few hand bones that could be hominin. So she sent an email to Dr. Fred Grimes with a picture of the lab table and said, here are a few things I've got. Do you know someone who could take a look at it? I was very fortunate in that I think he was maybe a bit too busy at that point and said, I have this colleague who's starting at Stony Brook next semester. She's familiar with Paranthropus teeth. I'm sure she'll come take a look. And so at that point, I flew out to Kenya very shortly after because Louise Leakey asks you to come look at a fossil, you go immediately. And once we started looking through the fragments, it became apparent that there was a lot more there. And that prompted her to direct excavations at that site for the next 2 years.
Very exciting. So was this the first hand of Paranthropus that has potentially been discovered, or was there something to compare this to?
This is the first one that we can definitively attribute. So in the fossil record, especially in periods of time that you've got as many as 4 different hominins on the landscape, you have to find something associated with craniodental material to say if it's one species or another. There had been other elements of an upper limb described by Richmond and colleagues previously that they had suggested belonged to Paranthropus boisei, but those weren't found with any bits of the skull or teeth. And so that was what was so special about this hand. In addition to being almost complete, it was found with several teeth and diagnostic parts of the cranium.
What, if you had to, was this a surprising find, or was it something that was being looked for, or was it by chance that something so put together was found, per se? If anyone wants to take that one.
I mean, we're always looking for a nice complete postcranial skeleton, but it's surprising when you find one, especially in these deposits where things have been out on the surface, tumbled around, walked over by goats. Anytime you find something this complete, especially when we're looking at something with such small elements like a hand, I think it's pretty incredible.
So when this hand was first found, and you mentioned, of course, it was found in relation to other remains that were made it easier to identify, what do you think was there something surprising about the hand after it was analyzed that perhaps we didn't know about Paranthropus before, such as maybe what they did with their hands?
Yeah, Kaylee, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most exciting things about this is kind of if you take the historical view of paleoanthropology and where Paranthropus kind of comes into the story, is that the Lewis and Mary Leakey's teams, right, that were working at Olduvai and first described Paranthropus boisei, well, then as Zinjanthropus, the genus Zinjanthropus, had originally considered that likely Zinjanthropus was the maker of many of the stone tools that were scattered across the landscape at Olduvai and elsewhere in Africa. They quickly kind of scrapped that idea when early member of a genus Homo was found at Olduvai Gorge and subsequently described as Homo habilis. And so Zinjanthropus kind of got written out of that tool-making story. And there was a hand associated with what has always been associated with Homo habilis from Olduvai Gorge as well, a juvenile hominin hand with only kind of some enticing pieces of the anatomy that told us about the potential tool-making capabilities. The joint at the base of the thumb and so on was suggestive of that. But there's been some debate about who this hand belonged to, whether it was Zinjanthropus, what became Paranthropus boisei, or belonged to the Homo hand. This has been a little bit uncertain. The truth is, we just really didn't know what a Paranthropus hand looked like. We didn't know what its capabilities, its functional capabilities were at all in terms of basic grips that were available to it that would allow it, what degree of tool use or making it could have been engaged in. So this is the first time we've kind of definitively been able to talk about the proportions of the hands. We know that now from this hand that the thumb is proportioned similarly to humans when we compare the thumb relative to the fingers. That's not particularly surprising. We know that earlier hominins like Australopithecus probably had kind of human-like hand proportions. So that in itself isn't necessarily surprising for an early hominin. But what is very interesting is the robusticity of the thumb. Very strong thumb with strong muscle markings, very clear markings for the intrinsic muscles of the thumb. So the muscles that attach within the hand and directly to the thumb that form that kind of bulge around the base of the thumb. Very clearly a strong, capable thumb in that regard. The distal phalanges of the thumb is very broad, would have mounted a fleshy pad to it that would have allowed for fairly fine manipulation. So from that perspective, that was the first, this is the first evidence that we have that the thumb of Paranthropus shared many of the characteristics that we think are functionally relevant in our own genus, Homo and Homo sapiens, that allow for tool use and production. There are some features that it retains that are we consider primitive characteristics, so it's not exactly like a later hominin. Some of the things at the base of the thumb are such that they probably didn't transmit those strong forces across the wrist in the way that we do, and some features there of the carpal bones that we share, humans, Homo sapiens share with Neanderthals and other hominins like Homo naledi, that suggests that more effective probably for protection of some of those small joints when you're repetitively doing these kind of manual tasks. So those sorts of things. So potentially the grips might have been slightly different in Paranthropus versus Homo. But the big picture of kind of the sorts of grips that you need for tool making is that those were available to Paranthropus. Does that prove that Paranthropus made the tools? No, but it certainly means that we can't rule out that Paranthropus was involved in those activities.
So in understanding the larger scheme of tool use, tool making in hominin ancestry and history, does this revise or change more broadly what we think about where tools originated and who used them? Potentially, of course.
So thinking about the origin of tool production, we actually know that it originated much earlier than we think Paranthropus was on the landscape, right? So between the cut marks at Takika and the Lemequian stone tools that have been found, hominins were making and using some form of fairly crude stone tool by at least 3.3 million years ago. So that predates this find quite a bit. I think it was even despite that, even knowing that probably some kind of Australopithecine was making and using stone tools, there had always been this narrative that once you have a split between Homo and Paranthropus, that you have Homo specializing in tools and they're the predominant user and maker of them, while Paranthropus was just kind of off using its teeth. So I guess it's not completely rewriting the narrative. We knew that earlier hominins were capable of stone tool production, but it's, I think, maybe bringing Paranthropus back into the spotlight a little bit in that regard.
One of the interesting things I think about this hand also is it tells us the sort of dual capability of the Paranthropus hand, right? It tells us, one, that it was likely had some significant manipulative capabilities that could be applied in a tool making context, but some features of its own, right, that are kind of distinctive of Paranthropus that are I think indicative of that split between Homo and Paranthropus. And to some degree, it actually parallels that or goes along with the narrative that Homo and Paranthropus were doing some different things, right? I mean, we know that from the craniodental anatomy. Almost certainly they had different diets. They were engaged in kind of their ecology in different ways. But the hand, I think, plays into that, at least in terms of our interpretation of what they might have been doing with their hand, because we go shift from the thumb side of the hand to the ulnar side of the hand, the pinky side here. We also have that bulge of muscle here and the intrinsic muscles that move our pinky finger. And my Zoom is waving at me because I'm waving my hand here. The development of the bones that are related to that, what we call the hypothenar complex that moves the pinky finger, is highly developed in Paranthropus. The little carpal bone, the hamate that's down here, has a huge projecting bony handle on it for the attachments of some of the muscles that move the pinky finger. The fifth metacarpal here in the palm has a huge crest that attaches one of the little muscles that moves the pinky finger, the opponent's digiti minimi. And the parallels that we see where we see this anatomy is really in gorillas. And there are other aspects of the hand that are very gorilla-like, the robusticity of the fingers, the depth of the little channels that send the long tendons from the forearm all the way into the fingers are very, very gorilla-like. But that hypothenar side, the pinky side of the hand, really jumped out at us as very much convergent on gorillas. These are not ancestral characteristics. This isn't something Paranthropus inherited from a gorilla-like ancestor, because we know Australopithecus didn't look like this. We know the earliest hominins don't look like gorillas in this aspect. This is something they converged on a gorilla-like condition specifically. And one way to explain it potentially is that it's related to climbing. Maybe they were doing climbing because gorillas do climbing. But some of the other anatomy didn't suggest to us that is a particularly focused on that. The curvature of the fingers it's fairly flat. The fingers are flat, unlike more kind of the higher curvature that you see in chimpanzees and other primates that climb a lot. Other earlier hominins have much more curved fingers. To us, it suggested that Paranthropus was climbing less, yet it developed this gorilla-like anatomy. So we looked for a different explanation, which was that it might be diet related and related to the harvesting and processing of potentially plant foods or something that they were doing that fed their very distinctive diet. We don't really know exactly what it is that the anatomy of the jaws and the teeth is related to, but we do know. But it suggests that maybe the hands also co-evolved with that, whatever that kind of ecological adaptation that Paranthropus had.
Yeah, and I mean, building on that, it wasn't, there were aspects of the hand that made us think that it wasn't arboreal, but I also wanted to see if maybe Cody could jump in, because the foot went along with that as well.
Yeah, totally. And much like the hand elements of Paranthropus boisei, there aren't foot elements definitively associated with boisei. And so this specimen offered a really exciting opportunity to understand aspects of foot morphology and potentially foot function in Paranthropus boisei. And one of the surprising things about one of the foot elements, it's the first toe bone on probably the pinky toe side. Most fossil hominins from, let's say, just older than maybe 5 million years ago until about 2.5 million years ago, most fossil hominin specimens, most of their toe bones are similar to one another in being sort of intrinsically elongated and moderately curved, in some ways resembling the toe bones of African apes to varying degrees. The surprising thing about this specimen is that it's much more human-like than the other fossil hominin species, like Australopithecus afarensis, for example. And so it's more human-like in terms of being sort of intrinsically shorter and lacking substantial phalangeal curvature compared to the earlier specimens and compared to modern apes. And so that suggests that the forefoot of Paranthropus boisei is more derived and modified potentially in ways that would seem to improve push-off in bipedal walking. And so much like the hand, displaying these gorilla-like morphologies, on the one hand, they could be suggestive of climbing, but on the other, the details of those similarities are potentially explained by something else, like manual processing of tough foods, like Kaylee mentioned. And I think the foot elements are consistent with that inference of possibly increased terrestriality among Paranthropus boisei. That's not to say that boisei didn't climb or couldn't climb, but rather that the signal and its morphology suggest a kind of evolutionary trajectory toward terrestriality, potentially. There's also another clue, if I just tend to keep going, and but there's another clue in another bone of the foot. It's an incomplete bone, but it preserves a portion that allows us to make an inference about one of the arches of the foot. And so everybody probably knows about the arch of the human foot, which is a longitudinal arch from front to back. But humans also have a side-to-side arch called the transverse arch. And there's evidence from biomechanical studies that the transverse arch of the human foot accounts for about 40% of the longitudinal stiffness of the foot. So that having a side-to-side arch is actually really an important part of the functional anatomy of weight bearing and push-off in bipedalism. And there's one sort of trait that's it's not really a magic trait, but it does seem to be a good indicator of the presence of the transverse arch. And that's a kind of a twist or torsion of one of the long bones in the middle part of the foot, which is the third metatarsal. And this individual preserves a part of a third metatarsal that displays the human torsion pattern, which is suggestive of the presence of a transverse arch. So not only does the boisei foot from these limited specimens suggest the presence of that arch, but the forefoot with its sort of length reduction, its intrinsic length reduction, that is, and its lack of high curvature values all sort of is collectively consistent with the idea of some significant terrestrial component of the boisei positional repertoire.
Very
I
fascinating.
just say that I love that when you're a hand person, you can hold your hand up like this and point at things. When you're a foot guy, you got to pretend that this is a hand.
Exactly. Yeah. Pretend this is
shoes
I
shows us
considered using my foot, but I didn't want to.
We appreciate it, Cody.
So how do these findings, do they paint a picture of how Paranthropus boisei would have lived? And is it any different than we thought maybe 10 years ago? Or is it a refinement of what we thought per se?
So definitely a refinement in so much as I think what we're suggesting supports some of what has already been said by the craniodental evidence, right? So there was no one questioning whether or not Paranthropus boisei was an obligate biped. At this point in the hominin fossil record, we have been for a while. It's descending from some kind of Australopithecine who is an obligate biped. We knew the position of the foramen magnum was very much tucked under the head, even more so than some of the Australopiths. So finding, for example, a bipedal foot is incredibly informative about how they were walking around bipedally, but we didn't need necessarily to confirm that they were walking around bipedally. So I guess is what I mean by saying it's a refinement, but not a revolution necessarily. Similarly, some of the things about the hand, I think are kind of adding nuance to what we think about their paleobiology, but not changing it entirely, right? So we already knew that hominins older than this were capable of producing stone tools. I think so. It's nice that we can confirm that for Paranthropus boisei. They are a bit more Homo-like than I personally expected, as far as the morphology of kind of the robustness of their thumb. But adding to that, kind of adding complexity to that, is that hypothenar side of the hand that Kaylee was talking about, and that's what I think ties in really nicely to what's already been said about the kind of the paleobiology of this species, and that's going back to the morphology of the dentition, the jaw musculature. As well as some of the isotopes that have been recorded from their teeth that tell us about their diet. I think this ties in really nicely with that.
I was just going to say maybe someone can explain a little bit about the environment that boisei comes from and the time range that they were inhabiting. Give us a little background on this species in particular and why these finds are important.
Do you want to take that one?
Carrie, you go for it. You work out there, actually, Kenny, in the actual environment.
Okay. All right. So there are 3 species of Paranthropus. When we're talking about Eastern Africa, that narrows us down to 2. So within Eastern Africa, early on, there's Paranthropus ethiopicus, that's known both from the Omo as well as kind of down through the rift. At about 2 million years approximately, that transitions to or gives rise to this later species, Paranthropus boisei. Paranthropus boisei is on the landscape at the same time as Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus at various points in time. That means that when we're thinking about Paranthropus boisei, we're always thinking about them in the context of kind of how were they dividing the landscape. So this is at the point in human evolution where we see a very kind of classic savanna landscape. The kind of C4 grasses have largely come into the region. It is not as dry as it is today. So today it is very arid to work there. You require lots of sunscreen. At the time that Paranthropus boisei would have been there, it would have been kind of much more kind of, I like to envision like the Masai Mara, actually, which is the image behind me. Right, so kind of a grassland. There would have been some trees, lake environments. Interestingly, with Paranthropus boisei, a study by Caden O'Brien a few years ago suggested that they tended to be found in much more specialized environments than the Homo species in the region. So while Homo you kind of find anywhere and everywhere, which tracks with this kind of more generalist diet, Paranthropus tends to be found particularly in these lake margin environments.
And would that be due to their, as you mentioned, their more specialist diet, or was there other reasons that could have made them so localized to certain areas versus being more broadly found?
I think the leading hypothesis is that it has to do with their specialized diet. If you look at the isotopes in their teeth, it's so restricted to such a small range. So, we divide, I guess for your listeners, I don't know if this is something they would be familiar with or not, but we divide plants kind of on the African landscape or globally, but let's talk about Africa, into C3 and C4 plants. So you can think of a C3 plant as going to be something that a giraffe eats, right? So like the leaves on a tree or the fruits on a tree that a monkey might be eating, all the way over to C4 plants, which on the African landscape tends to be grasses. So you can look at the isotopes that are preserved in an animal's teeth and say something about what they were eating. Very early on in hominin evolution, we see a high C3 signature, very kind of chimp-like diet. And that's not particularly surprising. We would expect that's what we would find. That diversifies a bit through time. And so it tracks kind of as the African landscape is changing, as the available kind of flora and fauna are changing. You see them incorporating more of the C4 into their diet. So you get kind of a broad range, especially in Homo. You see kind of a range of C3 to C4 foods. And then Paranthropus kind of focuses on just C4. And that's really the only, at least in Paranthropus boisei, I should say before Dave Straight comments on this video, at least in Paranthropus boisei, you see a very specific C4 signature that seems to be all they were eating. Shout out to Dave.
And so what going back to what Kaylee was saying about how the hand compares to gorilla hands, what do gorillas use their hands for that could extrapolate how Paranthropus boisei was using their hands that might be different than we thought before this hand was found, if that makes sense?
So, I mean, gorillas are obviously very good climbers, so they do climb. So that's, one thing I think we have to take into consideration as a potential behavior that's related to this. But they have the anatomy that we document that's related, that we relate to kind of gorillas here, is distinctive from, say, chimpanzee, which are even more they're more frequent climbers than most of the gorillas are. Gorillas then are also doing quite a few things. They're eating vegetation all day long, doing a lot of manual food processing to access nutritious parts of the plants, things like that. And some nice studies have been done documenting some of the grips that they use, and they seem to use that pinky side of the hand to a fairly high degree, especially these and across all these digits, essentially, pulling up vegetation. The vegetation is unlikely to be exactly the same that Paranthropus was eating, of course. Gorillas are fairly different in a lot of different ways of their ecology. So our thought was that this related to the food processing aspect of what gorillas do rather than the climbing. And a potential alternative hypothesis that we consider is that gorillas maybe the reason they look different from chimpanzees, say in the ulnar side, this pinky side of the hand, is because they climb slightly different, and that's true. Gorillas, when we quantify the kinematics, the movements of a gorilla and the way it climbs, it's distinctive from a chimpanzee. Proportions of the limbs are different, so potentially maybe they have to use slightly different grips than a chimp does, and that might necessitate different anatomy. The issue with this is that this is typically explained because gorillas are larger than chimpanzees, right? And so that's a perfectly good explanation, biomechanical explanation for why they would climb differently than their closely related relatives. But that doesn't explain it in Paranthropus, because Paranthropus isn't the size of a gorilla. So that led us to think, well, we need a different explanation for what it is that drove the evolution of this convergence on a gorilla-like anatomy in Paranthropus. It might be something else that gorillas do with their hands that Paranthropus is also doing. And so that's why we have leaned toward that sort of dietary hypothesis, or kind of food processing hypothesis versus the climbing hypothesis. But I think, again, likely could use their hands also for climbing, given how strong they almost certainly were.
Can I jump in and mention something?
Yeah.
Kaylee, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of like other examples of large-bodied mammals that eat plant material, plant foods, terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, and also use their appendages for grasping. And I was thinking about the giant panda and the false thumb of the panda, the radiosesmoid, I think it is, right? Which probably has something to do with manipulating food objects and sitting around all day chewing on things. I wonder if that is a kind of a case of convergence here, not in a gorilla-like manner, right? But another example of a mammal that has this sort of specialized behavior and diet to some degree, evolving things in the hand and wrist that might contribute to that somehow.
One of the really fun things about that comparison is if you compare side by side just like a bear cranium, a generalized bear cranium with a panda cranium, you actually see some of that tendency towards the zygomatic arches coming way forward. The anterior dentition gets tiny, you get much kind of more distinctive cresting. So it's a fun comparison craniodentally as well.
Are we designing
Yeah,
a new study?
there's a paper from the 70s.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? De Bruyne, I think, right, has a paper showing those convergences of panda and Paranthropus. And I remember I came across some working at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, I think, doing my dissertation data collection. And I was late one night, and I was just pulling out drawers, just kind of as I was bored and just looking at skulls. And I pulled out a panda, and I noticed all of those things. I was like, wow, the position of the sagittal crest, the peak is at the apex, and the zygomatics are moved forward. And look at those molars are huge, and the mandible is fused at the midline and is massive. And I pulled out a grizzly bear, and I looked, and I saw that it looked more like kind of a generalized Australopith in those characteristics. And I thought, this is amazing. I've discovered something fantastic. And sure enough, there's a paper from the 1970s. Somebody had already got onto that. But that was, but I think it's an amazing piece of convergent evolution. Probably not eating bamboo, Paranthropus, right?
So before we move on to the Ardipithecus paper and the ankle there, what do you guys think are the broader implications of the Paranthropus finds, and what are the next steps in understanding their behavior and how they lived, and perhaps why they went extinct?
So as far as broader implications, I think it's really exciting that we can use this hand not just to understand the hand of Paranthropus, but also to understand the hand of Homo and of our last common ancestor with Paranthropus. And that's because they would have shared a last common ancestor probably around 3.5 million years ago. I like to think of them as our evolutionary cousin. So we can do a kind of reconstruction based on the shared anatomy between this hand and what we see in later Homo, what would the likely last common ancestor have looked like? So it gives us a more complete picture of hominin hand evolution more broadly. And when I say it tells us more about the hand of Homo, I'm referring back to something Kaylee mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is that hand of Homo habilis, the OH7 hand, was always kind of iffy. Like it was probably associated with the jaw, but it wasn't entirely clear that it was. And so there was always a bit of a question of whether or not that really represented a Homo habilis hand. I think now we can compare that hand to this definitive Paranthropus hand and say something about whether or not it belongs to Homo habilis. Keeping in mind, of course, it's a juvenile, they don't preserve all the same parts, all of the normal caveats. But I think, we came out of this study feeling like that is pretty confidently a Homo habilis hand in comparison to kind of how different it is from this one. I think, there were more parts to your question. What do we do next? Is that
what's next in understanding?
So one of the things that we're working on, we're working closely with Tracy Kivel and Samar Sayeda, who is doing an analysis of the cortical bone. And that way we can say something about kind of the functional aspects of how they were using their hand kind of beyond the surface level anatomy. And so kind of taking it a step further, a little bit deeper, using micro CT scans of these bones to say something else about how they were using their hands.
Yeah, the amazing thing about this specimen, really, I mean, there are lots of amazing things about it, but the fact that we have so much of it to go on. I mean, most taxa, early hominin taxa, we have little bits and pieces of hands bones, right? This one or this
from
one
different individuals.
Or from different individuals. And so we kind of are piecing together the functional anatomy. And this is a case where we have a single individual with so much of the hand that can tell us so much about its capabilities. And I think there are a lot of, follow-up studies that can be done just refining our understanding of the functional anatomy of the hand. That'll tell us a lot about not only Paranthropus itself, but as Carrie was talking about, because this is a close cousin, we can use kind of phylogenetic inference, right, to infer what the last common ancestor was with Homo, and that tells us about Homo evolution as well. So even though this is kind of a side branch of human evolution, these side branches are really informative to the story of humans, right, because they allow us to kind of draw inferences based on the family tree about what the ancestral conditions would have been like. And so it's very exciting because it gives us so much information to do those sorts of things.
I also think too, it's a bit off of one of Carrie's earlier points, is that this specimen, of course, the hand, but also the foot elements, provide a kind of exemplar for Paranthropus boisei that we can use to possibly identify other fossil hominin specimens, or rule out identifications potentially for other fossil hominin specimens, and sort of help narrow our focus taxonomically, which is an exciting thing to think about for future studies.
Yeah, one of the sites that I've been working on fossils from is Drimmel in South Africa, which is right around 2 million years old. Wealth of fossils from there, lots of a different species of Paranthropus robustus, which is a kind of a little bit more generalized member of the Paranthropus family there, or clade. But we run into the same problem we have in East Africa, which is that these sites preserve not only Paranthropus robustus, but also early Homo. And so when you have all these isolated bits and pieces of the postcranial skeleton, it's really, really difficult to tell which one belongs to which species. And so something I've been running into is just that issue. And so this provides a little bit of information about what a Paranthropus hand looks like. Doesn't apply exactly to robustus because robustus is a bit more generalized, and boisei is really derived in a lot of ways. It's kind of taken the Paranthropus pattern to the extreme in a way that robustus hasn't quite. So, but I think it's going to help us to tease out some things, not only from East African sites, but hopefully from South Africa as well. And to give a plug, Carrie and I are organizing an invited symposium at the American Association of Biological Anthropologists in Denver in the spring, on Paranthropus postcranial anatomy, what we know and what we don't know about postcranial adaptations in this genus. Cody's participating, going to talk about some foot fossils and things, and we have a bunch of other colleagues and students who are contributing some pretty interesting talks. So for anybody who's coming to Denver in March, hopefully you can make it to our session.
That sounds very exciting, and I hope that it is very what's the word? It sounds very impactful for the people who will be there and get a lot of this information that is not necessarily so broadly found yet in one place. So moving on to the Ardipithecus paper and the ankle bone that was found there. Can one of you give us a little overview before we dig into the specificities of this paper on who or what Ardipithecus was, where they fit into the timeline, where they're from, etc.?
Sure, yeah. And Carrie and Kaylee, feel free to jump in and feel like you can also add some things here. But Ardipithecus was an early hominin genus that is known from Ethiopia. And please correct me if I get anything wrong, but it's known primarily from Ethiopia, from the Middle Awash and other areas. And it's sort of most known from a partial skeleton that's dated to about 4.4 million years ago. And so just over a million years older than the famous Lucy skeleton. And because of its age and completeness, it's sort of a keystone specimen in paleoanthropology, and allows us to ask questions about an earlier sort of time period in human evolutionary history, and represents a kind of transitional form, if you will, from a more sort of primitive, more ape-like ancestor toward a more human-like, more terrestrial biped. And so at the present time, the hypothesis is that Ardipithecus was a biped when it walked on the ground, but still retained a number of climbing adaptations that would have been useful for life in the trees, including a divergent hallux and a grasping foot. And so Ardi is really a unique species. Ardipithecus ramidus is really quite a unique species in that combination of features. There's really no animal alive today that has that combination of traits, and no species that seems to occupy that sort of dual locomotor world, perhaps, in the way that Ardipithecus ramidus might have.
And was this ankle bone that was analyzed in this paper, was this a newly found fossil, or was this from the famous individual that has been stored away for a while?
Yeah, so this is the talus, right? The ankle bone that's part of the partial skeleton that was published initially in 2009.
And what led to exploring this particular fossil, and did anything surprise you about its analysis?
Yeah, so and Kaylee, feel free to jump in here in a few moments. So I worked on Ardipithecus as part of my dissertation research, which was focused on reconstructing the evolution of the human foot, and specifically testing alternative hypotheses about the likely foot morphology of the last common ancestor that humans share with chimps and bonobos. And so I had the opportunity to study initially the cast of the Ardipithecus fossils at UC Berkeley, and then later the original fossils in Ethiopia. And so this paper sort of stemmed from that earlier dissertation research that I sort of elaborated on in collaboration with Kaylee and a few other folks. And then the second part of that, I think, was there anything surprising about this particular specimen? To me, I think the surprising thing about it is that is how African ape-like it is. And when I say African ape-like, I'm referring specifically to chimpanzees and gorillas. There are a number of features in the Ardipithecus ramidus partial skeleton that appear to be derived characters that we hypothesize reflect an early form of bipedal locomotion. But at the same time, Artie also retains all of these other characters that many people think are ancestral characters that appear to be quite African ape-like. And the talus is definitely an example of one of those elements. And so to me, it almost looks like you sort of combine Lucy with a chimpanzee and a gorilla. You sort of take characteristics from each of them and put them together, and you get the Artie talus.
And what does this
I
tell
would
us
say
about?
I don't.
I think there's a lag.
Oh, go ahead, Seth. Go ahead.
Kaylee, please go.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna follow up with so Cody knows the foot bones in intimate detail, I think better than almost anyone in the world. I know when we first looked at it, Matt Sherry and I had seen the fossil, and our initial impression was that you could drop that talus into a box of chimp tali and just sort of lose it. Cody, who knows the morphology better, has pointed out some features that are a blend of derived hominin-like characters, some subtle derived hominin-like characters, with those very clear sort of chimpanzee-like features. But it's a very ape-like looking talus, despite many of the characters that are clearly hominin-like in Ardipithecus. This is a very ape-like looking ankle bone, the talus. It's fascinating that way.
And I'll add one other detail about this, which I think is a kind of powerful empirical observation, which is that of all of the fossil ankle bones that are known in the kind of anthropoid primate fossil record, representing tens of millions of years of evolutionary history, there's only one specimen that is identifiably, sort of measurably African ape-like, and that's the Ardipithecus talus. And to me, that's a very sort of powerful observation that says a lot, that carries a lot of weight in terms of making inferences about how humans evolved.
And I know this is probably near impossible to answer, but do you have an idea of why that might be? Or is it just where it is in the timeline? Or were there other causes for it to be so African ape-like?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that humans share in common with African apes in terms of anatomy. And in fact, like before, early anatomists and sort of naturalists and evolutionary thinkers, before there was any knowledge of a fossil record or any significant fossil record, before DNA was discovered, right before phylogenetic methods were crafted, it's sort of long been hypothesized that humans are related to great apes somehow. And specifically, some people thought that humans are related to the African apes in particular. And so for a long time, the big question in paleoanthropology was sort of figuring out our place in nature, right? What is the phylogenetic position of humans relative to non-human primates? And that question wouldn't be satisfactorily resolved until really like the early 1990s, when people were able to cheaply and easily sequence DNA and reconstruct phylogenies using molecular evidence. And it sort of became an established fact that humans are most closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos. And to put it a different way, that implies that humans are positioned within the African great ape group or clade, which establishes a new big question, which is, from which kind of ancestor did humans and chimpanzees evolve? Was the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, reasonably African ape-like in the ways that we think are important, meaning in features related to, say, like body size and diet and locomotion. And the reason that matters for us is because it sort of establishes the context for human origins and establishes the evolutionary context for the origin of upright walking or bipedal locomotion. And so, generating a reasonable kind of inference about that last common ancestor is a really key part for piecing together not only how hominins evolved upright walking, but also potentially thinking about possibly some of the selection pressures that might have led to bipedal locomotion, which is the hardest question of all.
Can I hop in and add a little bit
Yeah,
about
please.
the last common ancestor? So one of the things that I think is most perplexing, like if you could give me a wish list of any fossil, um, is that we have no fossil record for the evolution of chimpanzees.
Mhm.
So, it's if we think about our last common ancestor with chimpanzees was about 7 million years ago. We have 15 hominin species populating the lineage heading towards us. The other one is completely sparse. And so, not only do we not know what the earliest hominins looked like, we have no idea what the earliest chimps would have looked like, meaning we have absolutely no idea what the anatomy of that last common ancestor would have looked like. And so, that's one of the reasons these shared attributes are so important.
I've heard a few reasons or explanations to why we are lacking those fossils, from lack of funding and difficulty of the environments in which they live to the acidity of forest and jungle soil. What do you guys think is the reason that there's been nothing found in relation to chimp ancestry?
I would say it probably not very controversially. It's really probably just a matter of geology and taphonomic processes that are involved with fossil preservation, right? In other words, there hasn't really been, across all of Central Africa, the right conditions for fossilization to occur for many African ape populations. Um, so that's I think uh, one
Or for
reasonable explanation.
the exposure of those fossils geologically, right? I mean, in East Africa, we're really lucky because the rift cuts the continent, from north to south, almost unzips it, the whole way, revealing all of those sediments from relevant time periods. Whereas in East Africa, it's a little, or west, as we move west through Africa, the geology is not the same, right? And so it's covered with forests. It's a difficult place to work. You might find locales where you have exposures of fossils, but they're more difficult to access, more difficult to identify. So I think it's mostly historical. Um, it's just a consequence of sort of the history of where humans been working, because it was easiest to work in the East African Rift and harder to work elsewhere. And so that's by and large, but also the taphonomy, possibly these, forest environments are just not suitable for preserving the fossils in the first place. So it's to be a mix of any of those things.
And we should probably also clarify that we're not saying that um, we're missing only chimpanzee and gorilla
Mhm.
fossils. It's not that we've got a huge fossil record spanning all of Central Africa with many different clades represented. It's really the case, to Kaylee's point, that um, the fossils are almost entirely, in terms of Central Africa, concentrated on the east side. And so it's an absence of many fossils of many different species, not just chimpanzees and gorillas.
Yeah. We don't
Yeah,
have
who
a
knows
good
how many
fossil record of the
hominins?
Diana monkey either.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So going back to
Sorry.
Artie a little bit, do we, if you could throw out a percentage as to how frequently it was arboreal versus terrestrial, how does that ratio kind of split by what the anatomy shows?
That's an excellent question, and I wish I had an empirically justified answer. um, I think at this point we can only sort of speculate. Um, it's a fun speculation, so I'm happy to do it. um, there's really two ways that we could address this question, I think. One way is through the analysis of the morphology and the kind of inferred functional anatomy of the partial skeleton. And the other way is through considerations of the paleo environment or reconstructions of the paleo environment through various proxies. And so, my research and my interest is mostly on the kind of morphology side of things. And, there have been various attempts to try to correlate observations of like trait variation to percentages of a particular behavior among living species. And occasionally those approaches work really well. And it turns out that for some traits, there does seem to be a kind of a tight correlation between how much tree climbing you use and, let's say, how curved your phalanges are, or how long your phalanges are relative to what your body size is. And if you examine those kinds of traits in Ardipithecus relative to living primates, my guess would be that Ardipithecus would probably be, as arboreal, quote unquote, as maybe chimpanzee populations.
Mm.
And so chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas as well, in terms of their actual sort of daily activity, are actually quite terrestrial, right? They spend a lot of time knuckle walking on the ground, whereas vertical climbing and other arboreal activities, actually, those are a much smaller proportion of their total sort of activity budget per day. But nonetheless, climbing still is an important part of the biology of African ape species. And so they retain all of these characteristics that make them effective climbers, like, for example, relatively long curved phalanges. Um, and so I would guess that Ardipithecus probably was terrestrial for a significant portion of its sort of daily activity budget, but used climbing um, at a significant amount, maybe similar to what you might see with living African ape populations, possibly. Um, but certainly arboreality, I would say almost certainly arboreality probably was a significant component of what Ardipithecus was doing, especially because it retains this sort of grasping ape-like foot. But I'm curious what you guys think, if there's a kind of another way to get at that question, maybe, that I'm not thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be error bars in any of those predictions, with in terms of, and some people have, as Cody said, been successful looking at kind of statistical correlations between particular aspects of the anatomy, quantifiable aspects of the anatomy, and these frequencies. And there will be a big, a range of estimates that arise from that. But I think Cody's, initial sort of gut reconstruction here is that chimps are probably a pretty good model for the kind of relative frequencies of terrestrial ground use versus tree use. And the tree use, even in primates that don't use the trees, the majority of the time, can be critical to their survival, right? If their food is up there in the tree, or that's where they sleep to get away from predators, it can be a key part of their ecology, and you can have selection then therefore acting on those features like the grasping foot, the curved phalanges, et cetera, that would facilitate that kind of behavior, even if at a fairly low frequency in your kind of overall time budget.
This is a critical point, Kaylee, that you're making, and it's that, like, the frequency, or like the amount of time a species spends engaging in a particular activity, is only a kind of a rough proxy for its evolutionary importance, because species can engage in activities less frequently, but which are very important for survival, maybe, or important for evolutionary fitness, kind of in the broad sense. And so again, like, even for the African apes, even if, like Western lowland gorillas, for example, let's say that they are 90% of the time terrestrial knuckle walkers, but in the 10% of time that they're climbing trees, it's very, very important not to fall out of the tree and die, or get injured, or have some other sort of, deleterious effect, right? And so we always have to be cautious about interpreting, even among living primates, and the kind of functional adaptive signals in their morphology and anatomy. We always have to be cautious in sort of connecting those observations to what they do. It's quite a complicated task, actually.
Just speaking a little bit, as you had mentioned the paleo environment, I wanted to fill that in
Mm.
a bit because it was so surprising when it came to ramidus. So, classically, we've thought about the evolution of hominin bipedalism emerging on a savanna, again, much like the background behind me here. So the trees go away, we come down from the trees, we start walking through the grassland. And so one of the really surprising things about the environment reconstruction in which ramidus was found is that it was a fairly wooded environment. So both the kind of isotope signatures as well as analyses of the soils and the fauna around there. There were colobine monkeys. So just a fairly wooded environment. And so I think this really, at the time it was published, prompted a reckoning of the savanna hypothesis. I know there's a paper famously titled "Is the Savanna Hypothesis Dead?" And I think people are still kind of working their way around that, and there's it also prompted us to think about ecological definitions of savanna versus just what we think of as a savanna, and actually woodland in that sense can fit into it. But yeah, so going back to this, it was a fairly wooded arboreal environment.
And I
Which is
know,
probably a good thing. If there's a grasping foot and you need to climb trees, maybe it's a good thing that there's evidence for trees being around.
Yeah.
so of course, infinite questions could remain about Ardipithecus, but I'm curious, as far as your research goes, what is next in your line of questioning? What remains unanswered, and what are you looking towards next?
Wow, there's so many unanswered questions about Ardipithecus, and hopefully more people can participate in asking and answering those questions, and I look forward to that in the coming years. Um, and Kaylee, I'm curious to know your perspective on this, but I think there's a big question at the moment about the functional anatomy of the wrist and of the upper limb in general in Ardipithecus, because one of the big, one of the unique things about the African apes is, which we've mentioned a few times already, is the presence of knuckle walking in those species. And previous studies have documented kind of a series of anatomies and observations related to the hand and wrist of African apes. And Kaylee's done a ton of this work in the past. Um, Observations relating those features to the biomechanics of knuckle walking. And I still think there are open questions about the extent to which early hominins have those characteristics, even if they were not knuckle walkers themselves. And so it would be great for there to be studies on the wrist and upper limb of Ardipithecus to try to tease apart some of these things.
And I'm guilty of owing my colleagues in the world some work on that for years, I think. But yeah, we have some data on. I don't know whether or not it'll speak exactly to the knuckle walking hypothesis, which is a really tricky one. Essentially, when we're looking at knuckle walking and the evolution of knuckle walking and its role in human evolution, if we're looking at anything that's become a bipedal hominin, for the most part, we have to look at a sort of what I like to call sort of decaying suite of features, right, that might have been related to knuckle walking, things that are sort of, in a sense, going away, right, throughout the lineage that you can identify. And it's a really hard thing to identify. So the clearest signs of knuckle walking are in the hand and the wrist, and the clearest one being little ridges that occur on the backs of the metacarpals, because their whole chimps and gorillas are holding their fingers like this, and it forms these kind of little ridges that develop there. Those are not totally known, but likely sort of plastic characteristics that develop within an individual's lifetime, because if you're just doing it repeatedly, the bone develops that way. So if you're no longer doing that, actively doing that as a species, that's never going to be there, right, within hominins, and that's the clearest signal. So then we're sort of stuck with looking at, as I said, this kind of decaying complex of anatomical features that we might be able to see sort of going away through time or preserved. There's one feature, the fusion of the scaphoid bone, which is here in our wrist, articulates with the radius there. The scaphoid bone in African apes and in humans fuses to a little bone called the centrale. So most primates have 9 carpal bones. Humans share with the African apes a fusion of that centrale and scaphoid to give us 8 carpal bones only. And there's been a lot of discussion about that and how it relates, and is it related to knuckle walking and stabilizing the wrist and strengthening the wrist when you're using your hand in that way. Some of my work has been on the biomechanics of the wrist and suggests that that fusion likely plays a role in limiting the mobility of the wrist and increasing kind of the overall stiffness of the wrist. And that would place some constraints on the subsequent evolution of the hominin wrist. And Ardipithecus, I think, has some clues there for us to kind of tie into. And I've been for too long trying to piece those things together, but eventually I hope to get some of those ideas out there.
I also think there's questions about how, like, both from an evolutionary and sort of, um, biomechanical perspective, about how you might transform a non-bipedal ape into a biped, and what does that process look like in terms of the evolutionary transformation and how traits sort of evolve together. What are the biomechanical consequences or causes or implications of that transition? Um, And right now I think we in the field lack data that explicitly link variation in all the traits that we pay attention to and measure for in terms of the fossils, linking those traits to performance in different contexts. And I'm using the word performance in the very broad sense of just like being able to walk and being able to run later on, right? And so I think many folks, myself included, are interested in sort of trying to fill some of those gaps so that we can generate more realistic inferences about function and performance in the early part of the human fossil record.
And hopefully, as the fossils become more readily available, as the original team has kind of worked on the Ardipithecus materials, kind of worked through their priorities, that eventually, there will become a wider availability of the data of scans of these fossils and things that allow for those sorts of biomechanical models that, they're nice musculoskeletal models of, for example, Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, that tell us some things about, what bipedality was like in an Australopithecus individual. And Ardipithecus has a lot to say about that. What is the kind of ancestral condition for an Australopith? So as a kind of an intermediate stage biomechanically of our locomotor system. And so I think, eventually we'll have a little bit more information about that, I'm sure.
And I think especially studies on internal structure in Ardipithecus would address a lot of these questions, And so, yeah, I look forward to seeing those studies in the future.
And on that note, I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but I wanted to ask if each of you wouldn't mind sharing, for the budding paleoanthropologists, as we know it's such a competitive field, any bit of advice you have on how to, let's say you're talking to a high school student, how to get where you are, either in the field or in your own lab, or just exploring the things that fascinate you so much and bringing those facts to life.
So I'll go first if that's okay. So I'm a first generation college student actually, and didn't know anything about anthropology or academia, and sort of discovered biological anthropology accidentally, and it became obvious to me, or I realized it was a possibility to pursue a career in paleoanthropology, oddly enough, and the first thing I did was get involved in research. And it's probably my number one suggestion, is to somehow get involved in research projects at a university, right? If you're an undergraduate student, that's fantastic. If you can sort of choose a university based on, the faculty there that are paleoanthropologists, even better potentially. But I think now as a junior faculty member, when we're looking at students as potential applicants for programs, research experience is always a big component of that. So I'd say any way you can, try to get some research experience.
Who wants to go next?
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, research experience is a big one. I'll add to that, stealing a bit of advice that was given to me by Bill Kimball, who I looked up to so much. He said, just read everything. You don't know kind of what you're going to end up interested in and what knowledge you're going to need to fall back on. We use geology and biology and kind of a range of different fields when we're thinking about these fossils. And so just reading kind of everything you have access to before you really kind of narrow down on your dissertation research.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, my advice is, intellectual curiosity to really, dig into these things, take every seminar that you have if you're going through graduate school, read those they're not stacks anymore, they're all PDFs. But when I went through graduate school, stacks of papers for every single seminar. And I think I benefited so much from that. Like Carrie said, just kind of reading everything and having a breadth, knowing those jumping off points for particular areas, who's working on isotopes, who's working on anatomy, who's working on, diets of extant primates that tell us about hominins, and having that sort of breadth of awareness of what's happening in your research world is really important. I'm going to give my bit of sort of unsolicited advice, maybe, but my advice to budding biological anthropologists, given the realities of the challenges of finding faculty positions and things as you move on in the career, is that one area of academic life where there are still jobs is teaching anatomy. And if you're able to get some anatomy training and be able to teach gross anatomy, that's how I've made it as a faculty member throughout my career post PhD. As I've always been in anatomy departments, teaching anatomy at a kind of medical school level. And there are still jobs, and we have shortages of anatomy educators. So it's a way for somebody who's interested in paleoanthropology and biological anthropology broadly to stay involved in academic life. I've been able to maintain my research, but the downside is I don't get to teach the fun classes in human evolution that these folks do, or that my wife, who's at the undergraduate campus, gets to teach. I teach anatomy and how to name the body parts over and over again, semester after semester, but it has allowed me this life where I'm involved in the field research, going out and doing field work and working on fossils and doing the stuff that I really want to do. And it's been a good life. So I would suggest anybody who's serious about that, make sure you get that training under your belt.
Yeah,
Can I add one
seconding
more
that,
thing?
I teach undergrad anatomy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just add one other thing. Sometimes when you ask people for things, they say yes. And, I can, think back to my own experiences. One of our colleagues, Matt Tocheri, I cold emailed him once when I was an undergraduate and said, "Hey, this paper on gorillas is really cool. Like, what about this other part of, of the story? Is that interesting to you? Have you thought about that?" And he said, "Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Like, do you want to do that?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And he met with me at a collection and brought with him a 3D scanner and a laptop that he let me borrow. And like, that's the reason I'm a paleoanthropologist, probably. And so anybody that's interested in pursuing something like this, sometimes it's intimidating, but I would say don't be afraid to ask people for help or to reach out to people. Sometimes it works out.
I will add to that.
Attend your regional conferences.
Yeah.
Conferences, yeah.
Attend the big conferences if you're able. I mean, the expense, but if you can go to local regional ones, sometimes those are inexpensive, and you can at least meet local faculty members that might connect you up. I mean, it's like anything. It's, there's the networking component. You want to get to know people who might be able to help you out with various aspects or be mentors. And you got to kind of, to some degree, you have to go where the people are. And there are increasingly, we have a Rocky Mountain Biological Anthropology Association where, folks from Colorado and all the different institutions get together, and undergrads can attend, and it's inexpensive, $20. And I know a lot of the regional, corners of the United States and so on will have these. So those are great places to have low pressure environment and kind of casual atmosphere to get to know people. Sorry, Seth, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say this series that you guys are participating in today and that my viewers seem to enjoy. We're going in, I think, to the 60s of episodes, and none of this would happen if I didn't, as Cody was mentioning, just kind of stick my neck out and email a few people who my partner said the worst thing they can say is no, and that they're not interested. And lo and behold, so many paleoanthropologists and archaeologists find it fascinating and hopefully fun sometimes to share their knowledge and everything that they've learned and their wisdom. And I think it's very beneficial to the scientific community that researchers share what they have experienced aside from what they write in papers. So I just wanted to thank the three of you so much for coming on this episode. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you. I will leave the floor open if there's anything the three of you want to add, but I think we will wrap it up here if you guys are good to go.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I just want to say thanks.
Best of luck to you and your program there in Portugal. I hope it's everything you want it to be, and I hope you really get all those great research opportunities we were just talking about, and that you come out of that with exactly what you want.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And again, just thank you to the three of you for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I know it's going to be very interesting to our viewers. So thank you, everyone. And we will go ahead and see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right.